Okay, so let's unpack this. Imagine you're trying to understand, the whole sweep of human history, everything that makes us who we are. You look at the big stuff, civilizations rising and falling, wars, incredible inventions, all that. But what if there's a hidden thread running through it all? Something primal, maybe, deeply connected to nature that we've largely forgotten or suppressed. You've shared some source material with us that argues exactly this, that our ancient, complex relationship with plants and substances that alter consciousness isn't some kind of side note. It's arguably fundamental to understanding how we got here and maybe even where we're headed.
That really is the core insight, isn't it, from the material you've provided? It challenges the conventional narrative, suggesting this relationship isn't just a footnote in human evolution, but maybe a central driving force. So our mission in this deep dive is to guide you through these sources, kind of pull back the curtain on some pretty fundamental assumptions we hold about ourselves, our past, and, well, our future.
Yeah, think of this as a journey we're taking together. We're going to look at how different plants, according to these sources, might have woven themselves into the very fabric of our societies, how they profoundly influenced our ways of thinking, and perhaps even left an evolutionary mark on our biology. It's a lot.
It is, and the sources invite us to step way, way back to the beginning. Imagine our earliest ancestors living in a time the material calls archaic or, pre-industrial and pre-literate. These aren't described as hierarchical societies like we know today. They're called partnership societies, nomadic groups, deeply attuned to their environment, often associated with practices like cattle raising and, interestingly, what the sources refer to as goddess worship.
Okay, and here's where the material gets really bold. It presents a hypothesis that's, frankly, kind of mind-blowing. It suggests that right at the absolute dawn of human consciousness, certain specific plants might not have just been part of their lives, but maybe a catalyst for our unique human minds. The sources point specifically to psilocybin mushrooms, like Stropharia cubensis, which, happen to thrive in grasslands alongside cattle.
Exactly. And the thinking presented is that encountering these mushrooms, perhaps just while foraging or following the herds, could have offered immediate, powerful advantages. At low doses, for instance, the source proposes they could enhance visual acuity.
Like having chemical binoculars.
Precisely. A massive edge for hunter-gatherers tracking game or spotting danger.
Right, makes sense. And at slightly higher doses.
Well, they're linked to increased restlessness and sexual arousal, which could, from a purely biological standpoint, lead to more reproduction, boosting the group's survival chances.
Okay, and then the really high doses.
That's where you get into the shared ecstatic experiences. The idea is these facilitated community bonding, maybe dissolving individual ego boundaries temporarily, strengthening social cohesion.
But perhaps the most critical piece, according to the sources, is the connection to language and self-reflection.
Yes, it argues psilocybin has this remarkable property, as they put it, of stimulating the language-forming capacity of the brain, creating this incontrovertible impression that language possesses an objectified and visible dimension.
Wow. So it's not just that words represent reality.
Exactly. In that state, it feels like words are building or shaping reality itself. Tangible.
That's a powerful idea. Language feeling almost magical, like the world is being woven from words.
And the sources connect this to the vocabulary we still use. We weave a story, we spin a yarn, suggesting this deep ancient link between language formation potentially catalyzed by these plants and fundamental human things like making narratives, making textiles.
And this isn't presented as something uniquely human, right? The plant use.
No, the material points to observations of chimpanzees actively seeking out and using specific plants, like Ascilia leaves, known to have medicinal properties. It's evidence that using plants for non-food reasons, well, it probably has deeper evolutionary roots than just our species.
The sources also bring up this concept of vegetable gnosis. What's that about?
It describes how shamans, through using hallucinogenic plants, claim to contact a mind behind nature, gaining what's called a higher dimensional perspective on experience. The idea is that nature itself has some kind of consciousness or intelligence you can access.
Through these plant allies, yeah.
So you get this picture of early humanity in this symbiotic partnership, really, with nature, potentially guided and shaped by this relationship with certain plants. But the sources argue something fundamental shifted. Something was lost.
Yeah. They describe a transition, and they draw on the work of Riane Eisler here, moving away from these partnership societies, which they characterize as, feminine, communal, sensitive to the ecosystem, towards what are called dominator cultures.
Right. Hierarchical, patriarchal, materialistic societies focused on control. often linked with warfare, male dominance taking over.
And the sources argue pretty strongly that this massive cultural shift was deeply tied to abandoning that original direct ecstatic experience from the plants.
It didn't happen instantly, though. It's presented as a gradual slippage, occurring in stages. First, substituting less potent plants for the really powerful originals.
Okay.
Then replacing even those active plants with inactive symbols.
Like religious symbols.
Could be. Then moving towards dogma-based religion that requires belief over direct experience. And finally, arriving at the secular scientism that's so prevalent now.
It really sounds like moving further and further away from a felt connection, replacing it with abstractions, rules, systems.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And the sources argue the consequences of losing that connection have been huge, leading to the alienation, the despair, the maladaptive behaviors. We see things like overpopulation, environmental destruction, using up resources like there's no tomorrow.
The material also offers a pretty sharp critique of certain Western viewpoints, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It explicitly challenges the Christian concept of an inviolable soul being somehow threatened by substance-induced altered states. And it presents a very provocative interpretation of monotheism,
How so?
viewing it not necessarily as divine truth, but potentially as a projection of what the source calls a paranoid, possessive, power-obsessed male ego.
That's definitely a strong claim from the material.
It is. And the source connects this view to historical examples of suppressing natural knowledge, like how the church in medieval witchcraft trials tended to downplay the actual use of psychoactive plants by accused witches.
Right, focusing instead on demonic pacts.
Exactly. Which arguably helped maintain control and sideline natural explanations that might have challenged the church's authority. It's framed as part of this pattern of losing that original plant relationship.
So as that direct access faded, people still sought altered states, right?
The argument is yes, that underlying human need didn't just disappear. Cultures looked for it elsewhere.
And the sources mention the substitutes that emerge. Alcohol gets a mention for its deep roots, obviously.
Yeah, alcohol is ancient and widespread. But the material then looks at more recent substances and how they shaped global values and cultural styles. Sugar, for instance. It's linked not just to addiction and slavery, which is historically undeniable, but it's presented almost as a driver and symptom of that emerging industrial dominator style.
Interesting. And coffee and tea.
Called drugs of gentility, connected to the exploitation needed for mass production, reinforcing the values of that new, maybe more controlled industrial culture.
Then there's opium, the Opium Wars, its cultural impact, and tobacco, too.
Right, tobacco's rapid global spread, often pushed initially through things like quack medicine. It all fits a pattern, according to the source.
And then things really accelerated with chemistry.
Mid-19th century onwards, yeah. Organic chemistry brings synthetics. More powerful, often more addictive drugs, heroin, refined cocaine, later things like MDMA, even anabolic steroids.
Leading to what the sources call a culture deep into psychopharmacological engineering.
Where we increasingly rely on substances, natural or synthetic, to change how we look, how we perform, how we feel.
So the overall picture the sources paint of modern industrial Western society is pretty bleak.
It's described as heavily narcotized. We've become maybe inured to the consequences of our actions, pursuing business as usual in what's called a surreal atmosphere of mounting crises and irreconcilable contradictions.
And this state is seen as a direct symptom of that dominator style and its messed up relationship with substances, seeking fulfillment or escape everywhere but the original source.
That's the argument presented, yes.
Okay, so if the sources argue we've lost something vital and ended up, well, here, is there a way back? Can we reclaim that connection?
The material proposes the possibility. It's termed an archaic revival.
Archaic revival, what does that entail?
It's not just seen as a political or social shift. The sources suggest it has to be rooted in a transformative personal experience. It means fundamentally rethinking our relationship with psychoactive plants, seeing nature itself as a legitimate source of knowledge and experience again, and challenging the whole idea of illegal plants. The source calls that concept obnoxious and ridiculous when applied to things growing naturally, used for millennia.
So a renewed shamanism is part of this?
Potentially. Specifically involving the responsible use of hallucinogenic plants. It's presented as maybe the last best hope for reestablishing communication with that mind behind nature, gaining crucial new perspectives that we desperately need to navigate the global crises we're facing.
The material also traces the modern rediscovery of these compounds, right?
Yes, it chronicles the scientific work, characterizing key hallucinogenic compounds, especially the indoles. It mentions pioneers like Louis Lewin, R. Gordon Wasson, Albert Hoffman, Richard Spruce, people who really dedicated themselves to exploring these substances in their traditional uses.
And there's a particular focus on psilocybin and DMT.
There is. The argument is that these specific tryptamines might be central because they're structurally so similar to our own neurochemistry, especially serotonin.
Which hints at a possible deep biological or evolutionary link.
That's the suggestion, yeah.
DMT gets special mention for being intense but brief.
Extremely intense, often very profound but short-lived experiences, yes. And the sources note that ancient ways of using it, like snuffing powdered plants, were often much more effective than early modern attempts like injection, suggesting maybe a lost indigenous knowledge about how to best work with it.
But this whole potential path, this archaic revival, it faces huge hurdles, legal ones, cultural ones.
Absolutely. The sources view the modern drug war, particularly classifying compounds like psilocybin and DMT as Schedule 1, which the material argues was done largely without solid scientific evidence.
Is rooted in fear.
Deeply rooted in fear, according to this perspective. Fear of challenging that egocentric dominator culture, fear that's often tightly linked with religious fundamentalism, and maybe a deeper unconscious fear that the established order feels whenever those boundaries, self and world, ego and cosmos, start to dissolve.
The sources don't mince words here. They argue this suppression isn't just bad policy.
No, they frame it as a civil rights issue, restricting deeply personal practices, potentially limiting religious freedom, and infringing upon the fundamental privacy of your own mind.
They draw parallels to historical resistance, like resisting anatomy dissection, or challenging the divine right of kings.
Exactly. Resistance to things that fundamentally challenge the established power structures or dogma of the time.
So where does this leave us, you, the listener? What's the potential locked in these substances, according to the sources?
Well, they're described not just as drugs, but as tools. Consciousness-expanding tools, offering access to what are called hyperdimensional states.
Okay, hyperdimensional, that sounds complex. What does that mean in this context?
Based on the source material, it's tricky to define precisely, but it's presented as experiencing reality in a way that feels like perceiving beyond our usual 3 spatial dimensions. Maybe accessing a sense of interconnectedness or layers of information that are normally hidden from us.
And these experiences might offer connections to what?
The suggestions are pretty out there. A remarkable overmind, the soul of the world, maybe even interaction with what feels like another intelligent species, not necessarily little green man, but perhaps intelligences inherent in consciousness or nature itself, an engagement with a nearby alien universe, as the source puts it.
At the very least, high adventure for the mind.
That's one way it's framed, yes.
And the sources push it even further, suggesting these hallucinogenic indoles might be more than just experiential tools.
They postulate they might act as agents of evolutionary change for the human species itself, by potentially reinforcing adaptive traits like that enhanced visual acuity we talked about, increased reproduction, maybe even driving that crucial language capacity.
Wow. Okay, so ultimately, the material presents us with a kind of core choice.
It does. It views our pervasive addictions, sugar, TV, alcohol, harder drugs, whatever, not just as individual failings, but as a collective, restless search for the thing torn from us in paradise. That lost connection to profound, naturally induced states of being.
And in this view, the shamanic hallucinogens are the original answer.
The found answer is the phrase used, the original, maybe healthier way to access those necessary states.
And the alternative, if we don't face this innate and legitimate need, as they call it, for an environment rich in these kinds of mental states induced by will.
Is just continuing down the current path. Toxic, low-awareness existence. The source uses that powerful image of the golem for modern humans, sedated consumers, lost to everything but consumption, cut off from deeper meaning, from connection.
The stakes, then, according to this material, are incredibly high.
Couldn't be higher. The suppression of this whole area of exploration prevents us, it argues, from understanding our true identity, and from addressing the fundamental crisis of our civilization, which the source sees as a direct, tragic consequence of breaking that original symbiotic relationship with the Gaian matrix, the living Earth system.
So we've taken a really deep dive today into a challenging, definitely thought-provoking set of ideas, arguing that our history is fundamentally shaped by this relationship with psychoactive plants, a relationship largely forgotten or suppressed, with massive consequences for our culture, our planet, ourselves.
And the source material we've explored, which is powerfully articulated in the work of Terence McKenna, leaves us with a pretty significant question to mull over. He asks, if the expansion of consciousness isn't a major part of the human future, well, what kind of future will it be?
It suggests maybe that the tool for the redemption of the human enterprise has actually already been found. The question now, perhaps, is whether we, as a species, have the wisdom and the courage to pick it up and figure out how to use it. Thank you for joining us on this exploration today.